the usual items of housekeeping. Please keep your mobile phone switched off or on silent mode, and I ought to do the same. Also, please note we don't expect a fire alarm test today, so should the alarm sound, it's probably genuine and we have to get out as quickly as possible and follow the fire and emergency procedures of the council house. I'm also obliged to tell you that this meeting is broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of subsequent repeat viewing. By entering the Wallspike room and during the course of the meeting, councillors are consenting to being filmed and the use of those recordings for webcasting. So smile, you're on candid camera. So good afternoon and welcome to the EGM of the Audit and Governance Committee. We shall take item number 1 of the agenda to receive apologies for absence. And I think we've got a full house, so there's no apologies. That should be Mr. Online is Mr. Shipley, isn't it?
He's struggling to get in, and we're trying to get him in.
Right. He's not offered his apologies, so I think he is there somewhere in the ether. Moving on to item number 2 of the agenda, declarations of interest. Do any members have anything to declare? No? Jolly good. Item number 3 of the agenda, Chair's urgent business. I don't have anything to bring to this meeting under this agenda, Vice Chairman. No. Thank you. So, without further ado, let us move on to item number 4 of the agenda, which is the substance matter of this EGM, the public consultation regarding the council's electoral cycle. I do beg your pardon, I just thought I'd switch that mobile phone off. Yes, to recap, there was a meeting of the full council in March, and this decision was delegated or deferred, should I say, to this committee to resolve. We addressed it at the last meeting, at the Audits and Governance meeting, and we decided that we needed further information before we could come to a conclusion. In overview, the electoral system as it stands has been with us. Well, the previous system was with us when God was a boy. Basically, we had all-out elections every 4th year, and it often does not coincide with a general election, which meant less duplication of work for officers. A resolution was passed in 2001, I think, or thereabouts, changing it to the current system of election by thirds. Now, of course, there's no right or wrong answers here, ladies and gentlemen. Councils have traditionally had an unfettered discretion as to which system they apply. Some councils have election by halves, others have election by thirds, some have all-out elections. So there are no right or wrong answers, although the impetus now seems that the Electoral Commission are pushing us towards going to the 4-year cycle. Now, this council will ultimately make the decision. We are here today to decide on the consultation aspect of this. And if you want to have a bit of information about the pros and cons of each system, if you turn to page 9 of the notes and go to paragraph 3.4, there's a useful summary of the pros and cons of the different, the election by thirds or the all-out elections. Once we have conducted the consultation process, which will not be a referendum, it will be merely a consultation exercise which will not bind the council. We as councillors will make the decision ultimately, then of course it will go to full council for a vote. Now, Mr. Perrott is going to give you a bit more information about this, and then we will discuss the proposal, which you will find on page 1 of your bundle. The only thing I would point out is there is a time constraint, which I'm sure Giles will draw your attention to, given the fact that the Chief Exec has already received notification from the local government reform body that we are due for electoral review. Giles, I'll pass it to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm also well aware of the fact that some members of the committee have already discussed this at some length and are aware of the papers, whereas others are joining us for the first time, but obviously have reviewed their papers. I wanted to just focus a little bit on drivers for this and timelines, talk a little bit about the legislative discretions, and then really just be here to answer any questions that members of the committee might have about it. I think it's probably worth reiterating right at the front that the recommendations in front of the committee here are purely about public consultation about the electoral cycle, as opposed to any decision whatsoever concerning whether it should be retained, but the current third system should be retained or changed. But clearly, if issues come up connected with that, I'd be more than happy to speak to them. So the associated but not directly related issue, which I know that that Councillor Evans is aware of as leader of one of the main parties in the City Council, is the finally, the Boundary Commission for England have informed the Council that they will be undertaking an electoral review of the city. Quite confusing, it's not called a boundary review, it's called an electoral review as part of their rolling programme. These should ideally take place every 5 years, but as you've already pointed out, Chair, our last review was in 2000, 22 years ago. It's quite a it's a statutorily driven process which starts off with how many councillors should a council have. The council in question that's undergoing the review is free to make a proposal to the Boundary Commission in advance of the review about how it sees its governance being best served by a specific number of councillors. It then moves on to re-examining the ward layout of the local authority. And obviously, in our case, there's been a not insignificant amount of demographic change since 2000 in terms of population, but as I say, also demographics, so that the boundaries of our ward structure can be reconsidered against the what's happened over the last 22 years. The Boundary Commission then make a proposal to the council that is then debated and negotiated with both councillors and officers throughout the process before an order is laid in front of Parliament and then formally changes the those specific areas of the governance arrangements for the council. All electoral reviews result in an all-out election, not surprisingly, because numbers and boundaries have changes. So if you have an electoral review, at the end of that process, an all-out election takes place. The Boundary Commission have not offered us discretion as to whether or not we have an electoral review, but they have offered us discretion as to what year it would take place, and therefore what year the resulting all-out elections would take place. They did initially ask us in November 2021, and I know also there have been conversations between the leaders of the main parties subsequent to them. We are somewhat past the deadline for informing them, and obviously if the council wants to have discretion on that, it would be useful to know. The reason for raising this as a driver in terms of our electoral cycle is that the Boundary Commission have made it clear that for councils who opt to retain the elections by thirds system, the number of councillors in any ward must be divisible by 3. And as I think as all members are aware, we currently have 3 wards in the council that have 2 members. If the council did opt to, by the 2/3 majority that was mentioned, to change its electoral cycle to all outs, then 2-member wards could be retained. But if it retains its elections by thirds, then it would need to be aware before the electoral review started that we wouldn't have any 2-member wards as a result of the review. That is something the council needs to inform the Boundary Commission of prior to the electoral review starting. And the proposal in this paper is that that the council would recommend that an electoral review that resulted in elections in 2026. 2 key reasons for that. Firstly, I think all members are also aware we have a fallow year with no elections in 2025. The following all-out elections in 2026 would mean that the minimum term served by any councillor would be 2 years, whereas obviously if one had all-out elections not following a fallow year, then the minimum term served would be 1 year, because we will have had local elections prior to that. Another key reason for choosing a review that results in all-out elections in 2026 is that for both members and officers, the somewhat full-on job of consulting and negotiating, I'm using the word negotiating, I think it's probably consulting with the Boundary Commission over ward boundaries and numbers of councillors, is quite an intense period of work, requiring a great deal of stakeholder engagement, and B, a great deal of statistical information exchange and debate. It would be quite difficult to, given both the time that members have and also the time that officers have, to conduct that at the same time as conducting local government elections. So the other advantage of the electoral review taking place during a fallow year is that both members aren't campaigning in the same way as they would necessarily if there were elections, and secondly, particularly members of our elections and registration service would have the appropriate time to put into the electoral review, as opposed to administering local elections in that year. So that is the thinking. Once again, it is at the discretion of the council to, in consultation with the political party leaders, to suggest to the Boundary Commission at what point the electoral review out of those two choices should take place. Driver for having a settled position on our election cycle is that needs to be informed prior to such a review starting. There is an easier to view online, I think, than on paper. At the appendix of the report, there is a timeline showing the main elements of the process of the electoral review in the relationship with local elections for illustrative purposes, outlining what the key dates would be if the council opted for a review ending with elections in 2026. Which would effectively be initiated by a meeting with the council's managerial and political leadership in December of next year. Hence the desire for a settled position on electoral cycle to be reached prior to December next year, which hopefully you can see how that informs the timetable set out in this report. I think another key issue, just to be very clear about, it's not essential that councils use their powers, as it's set out here under Section 116 of the Local Government Act 2003, to conduct a consultation exercise, but it does provide a very useful statutory framework for that to take place. And many councils who've conducted, in fact, all in our research group who've conducted any consultation regarding election cycles have used Section 116. And I think probably the most important thing to know about that is that the results of it are not binding. They are specifically not binding. It's a discretionary consultation process, and a council, following the use of its powers under that Act, is perfectly free to make any decision, not one necessarily based on the outcome of consultation in that area. I think hopefully the rest of the report, even though there's a lot of it, is relatively self-explanatory, and I think those members who directly took part in our corporate peer challenge in February will be aware of the fact that the LGA and our peer reviewers, once again, have no opinion as to what elections cycle this council should pursue. But they did feel that, well, they felt moved to recommend to us that we move forward to proposals to review the electoral cycle to help reach a lasting conclusion. And I think from having discussed this with several of the people on the team, it feels that there's been a debate in the background as to whether which election cycle best suits a medium-sized unitary council like Plymouth, and it was felt that it would be appropriate, given the importance of a decision like this, to bring that to a settled position where the council had formally made a decision about it and we were able to move forward on the basis, certainly for the foreseeable future, on one or other cycle, rather than for the debate to be continuing in the background. Since the report that you received at the beginning of the summer, there is an additional recommendation about the Boundary Commission review dates that we would propose to the Boundary Commission for the electoral review. And I think at Councillor Evans' request, there is a little more data on some other councils' experience in terms of consultation around this subject, in addition to the data that was received at the last committee meeting. But I know I've sort of glossed over the top of the debates. I know that various of you have received briefings or were present at the last meeting, so it's probably best for me to stop now and allow the committee to engage with the subject. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Perritt, for that detailed report. I think I had a general observation as well when you talk about the different authorities across the area and the model that's suitable for them. The Southwest Peninsula's probably got 29 odd local authorities in that area. I think the vast majority of them do go for the election by the full-blown 4-year election cycle. So we seem to be in a bit of a minority. But the proposition before the committee today, and we will discuss it and come up with an answer, the proposition is a public engagement consultation is undertaken using the powers under Section 116 of the Local Government Act 2003 between June and August of 2023 on the issue of moving from the current electoral cycle of elections to whole council elections. That's once every 4 years. The second limb is the Audit and Governance Committee oversees and agrees the design and implementation of the consultation, in particular who will be consulted, engaged with and how. And certainly I would suggest that we come up with a working group as well to deal with that. The third part of the proposition is the Council confirms that the Boundary Commission review commences in December 2023 and is concluded across 2024-2025 with the resulting arrangements implemented in 2026. So it's open to the floor now. Observations, questions, comments, please. Mrs. Benny.
Thank you. I've just got a couple of specifics really just to help my understanding of the paper, if that's okay. So just looking at page 10 of the actual document, that's 12 of the pack, I was just interested to understand the finances there. Is that based on today's costs? I'm not sure who the right person is to be asking this. Is that based on today's cost, or does that include an estimated inflationary element? Because for me, potentially, there could be a greater benefit, but I wasn't sure about that.
That's a very good question. And with everything rising because of inflation, I would assume that these are general broad brush figures and don't take into account inflation.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I feel necessary to call you Annette rather than Mrs. Benny, but either way, in the circumstances. The first thing overall about the financial estimates, it is a really difficult area to estimate, and the reason for that is that if our local elections coincide with either a general election or a police and crime commissioner election, then the costs to the council of undertaking the local elections reduced by 50%, because there's the government take financial responsibility for general elections and police and crime commissioner elections, and therefore I wouldn't want to describe it as a subsidy, but a lot of the costs of polling stations and the count and etc. Now, of course, I think the Elections Act is now in fact repealed, but it was interesting to find out that it was never actually its guidance and stipulations were never actually stuck to ever since it was first introduced about there being an election every 5 years. So It's very hard to, and certainly over the last 5 years, it's been extremely difficult to forecast when a general election would happen and therefore whether our costs are going to reduce by 50%. And Police and Crime Commissioner elections are a little bit more because they're every 4 years, but even they were postponed by the pandemic. So as we forecast, we're having to make assumptions about when local elections may or may not otherwise coincide with another election, therefore reducing costs to us. But obviously, at the beginning of this debate, the impact of inflation wasn't really seen as being a huge, apart from RPI, at, roughly between 1 and 2%, as it has been for some time, wasn't really seen as a key issue. Whereas now, I imagine we might make those forecasts differently. I suppose what I would say in the council's modelling at the moment, the cost items that are particularly subject to inflationary pressure, such as energy and the cost of our own and other full-time staffs and contracts have been seen as the sort of key areas. So we and those aren't as sensitive as they are, for example, in the construction industry and the capital programme as they are with this. But nonetheless, there would be potential increases. But we've tried to be careful about describing the financial projections as the best forecast we can make given the amount of assumptions that we have to make as opposed to something rock solid. And that's the other reason why they're taken over 10 years rather than a shorter period. Sorry, that's an incredibly long answer.
No, that's helpful. It just gives me that context. There's just an add-on to that, if I may. So what I also then didn't understand, and it may be that I've missed it somewhere in the narrative, in the table under section 4, we've got the all-out elections every 4 years and the elections in thirds. And in that list, I can't see any allocation for local police and crime commissioner in the every 4 years one. And I wasn't sure why. Is it because it would be funded in a different way? Because they've still got to happen, presumably.
Yeah, but I'm very pleased to say they're not at a cost to the council.
Right, but they are in the elections and thirds, because we got them. We've got some of them put in. So we got 200 in 2024, 200,000.
That's because it's money cost related. You have to spend 200 because half the cost of running the council election at the same time as the police crime commission.
Oh, I'm with you. So there's a benefit to that, which is what I'm with you.
That's
Okay.
why it's reduced by 50k.
Okay, I'm with you. I understand now. Thank you. Thank you. Fab, thank you.
Any more? Yes, Councillor Finn.
Yeah, just one thing, Chair. So just to get this absolutely clear, obviously this is a consultation that will come before council. What if the council chamber directs the opposite to the consultation? What is the ramifications with regard to the Boundary Commission? Please.
I think the answer is the council is not going to be bound by the referendum. It's not a referendum, sorry. The council is not going to be bound by the consultation process. We carry out the process and it's for councillors to decide and then vote on it. If it goes against the dictates of the public, that's to the conscience of the individual councillor. So clearly the consultation process is just going to establish how the good people of Plymouth wish the system to work, and then it's for us to take it to the chamber and bring it to a conclusion.
Chair, could I make a brief addition as well?
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. I think the 2, 3, in fact, other issues that are important are members will have noted that the response rate to consultations in many, if not all, of the consultations that we've set out in the report for illustrative purposes have, in my view, certainly, and probably your view as well, been very low. So, for example, Derby, which has a population significantly in excess of Plymouth's, was talking about, I think, 580 from memory. I haven't looked it up. responses, albeit with a number of other responses from businesses and other key stakeholders, because I think the important thing to realise about this, it's not just asking the public, it's asking a lot of other people who are affected by council circles. But the information that the council would receive, as well as a view, would be firstly how many people were motivated to actually respond, which I think is quite important. It gives quite strong signals to the council. I mean, I think this council's got quite a strong tradition of working hard to maximise responses. I mean, certainly the way that we consulted on our local plan, and even last year's budget consultation had over 1,100 responses, which is starting to get into statistical significance. It tends to be the sample size, albeit stratified by Gallup and Opinion and various other people. But so we would, the council would receive a feeling about the amount of public interest in this via the return rate. And the second thing would be whether there are very strong opinions raised with a clear majority one way or the other, or it might be that the results would show it was very finely balanced, and all the more important that the council had its own view. So it wouldn't just be the raw outcome of that. Nonetheless, having undertaken that consultation, and if there was a clear outcome, then the council would need to be able to demonstrate that it had taken those views into account with its eventual decision, because otherwise a judicial review or similar of a decision such as that would probably have more evidence to support it if the council had taken a view opposite to a substantial view from the public that it had sought.
Thank you, Mr. Parrott. Councillor Evans?
Well, I don't want to talk about the merits of the case, because we're not being asked to do that today. That'll be the subject of a vote in council down the track, to what you were implying. But I've got some serious problems with the table of pros and cons. I really have, because this is worse than the leave versus remain stuff. To be honest, because I mean I don't know how these have been drawn up, but I would have expected, if you're going to ask people whether they want to fundamentally change the way in which we do our election cycle, you're going to have to come up with a better list than this. I mean, just give you an example. Constant year-on-year campaigning by councillors and political parties may lead to voter fatigue and a lack of interest. Well, what's the evidence for that? There's virtually no difference. I mean, I'm going to argue against myself now, but when we went from annual election to 2 annual elections from all outs, one of the arguments was that it would lead to a rise in turnout. It didn't, about the same. So there's no effect, actually, statistically, on voter turnout of whether there's annual elections or all elections. So that's one example where there's an innate bias in the way in which these advantages and disadvantages have been drawn up. I've got to argue again with the phrase substantial savings. This is an 11-year period where it is said here we will save £1.1 million over 11 years, which is £100,000 a year. How much? What is the total spending of the council in that over that 11-year period? And what proportion of that is represented by the cost of elections? So I'm looking for to stand up the word substantial here. Right? When you bear in mind our gross spending, not the net spending, the gross spending of this authority is £500 million a year. Right? So we're talking, I think, I must have got my maths wrong, 5 billion, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Over 11 years, right? And we're going to save £1 million. So how do you define substantial in a context of 1,000th of the spending of the council? How do you even justify that as a statement that the council's putting out to the public about a reason for changing the cycle? So these are the kinds of things that even, we might accept this today. I won't accept this today in the form of words. If this is how we're going to ask people, it needs a review. it needs people who got experience of asking non-biased, right? Because there's conscious bias in this. There's no doubt about that. As well as unconscious bias, there's conscious bias in this, and it needs to be sorted out before we put this question anywhere near the public, because otherwise it will be misleading, may even leave the council open to some legal action from some people, who knows. But I think we have to be very clear about this. So I think, you know, that would be my major reservation about pressing the button. And I think I'm already getting a sense of urgency here that I wasn't before when we had the discussion in Council Chamber before. This seems to be speeded up all of a sudden. And when things are speeded up on this magnitude, mistakes get made and decisions are made which can't be undone easily. I've got another question on a technicality about the work with the boundary. You didn't call them the Boundary Commission, did you? Did you call them the Boundary?
I did, and rather than the Electoral Commission.
The Electoral Commission. Well, whichever it is, right? So, if I can recall from the conversation we had in the Council Chamber when I was wrong about what I said, which, and you just referred to it now, but the legislation change it, that actually it doesn't need a vote, it doesn't need them to tell us and approve, we can do it. So this is the bit I'm not quite getting, you see. If we can do that, right, and change boundaries, where does this business about if you want to have annual elections, you can't have any more two-member wards come from? Because surely, if the legislation allows us to change the ward boundaries ourselves without permission of anybody else, why are the Boundary Commission telling us that we've got to get rid of two-member wards? Have they got different legislation? Sorry, not the Boundary Commission, the Electoral Commission.
Thank you, Councillor Evans. I mean, and I won't be the slightest bit defensive of the report, but I will say that the advantages and disadvantages piece was taken from the Electoral Commission report, which is footnoted at the front page, and I know that doesn't absolve me from any responsibility for bias or otherwise, but at least I have known my sources in terms of the area, and certainly I think we would the type of information as well as the questions that formed part of any campaign would be subject to what this committee decides, would be a matter for it to consider. So that's where those the advantages and disadvantages came from. And whilst I completely accept that, as I ought to as an officer, that the savings are an extremely small multiple of the council's overall revenue budget. They're quite a big chunk of the elections budget within the council, which is obviously an issue to be considered. But Councillor Evans, in respect of the issue that you raised about the council has complete discretion over its election cycle, and its only duty is to inform the Boundary Commission of its elections cycle. It's bound by its own constitution, but in fact the legislation as well, that any change needs a 2/3 majority within the council. But other than that, that is at its discretion. Its ward boundaries and its number of councillors will be the subject of a report that is produced by the Boundary Commission and laid before Parliament. And whilst it will be the subject of, I'm sure, very animated discussion between the Boundary Commission and the council, that report will be a submission by the Boundary Commission to Parliament. So size and ward boundaries will be need to be negotiated and proposed by the Boundary Commission. And the one condition that they raised in their letter to us was that whatever the arrangements that come out of the boundary review, is that councils that elect by thirds must end up with a ward and councillor pattern that means that the number of councillors in each ward is divisible by 3. So that's the only area that they're asking us to inform them in advance about.
Could I just just mention one point as well, Councillor Evans, because I totally agree with you about the wording. I think this was merely a sort of suggestion of, for the benefit of the committee, the pros and cons of the system. Point you made last time was We've got to get the consultation right. The information we put out there has got to be written in a user-friendly way. It's got to convey the point, and it's got to be done as a proper job, as we say locally. And I was going to suggest if we have a working committee to deal with that, and we hone it, and then we can be sure of a proper consultation job. But yes, your question.
I was going to make a practical suggestion about it because, you know, we've used them in the past, but the university, one of the Plymouth universities, are used to doing surveys in a sort of non-partisan, non-biased way. So they might help us with that. You know, we might ask them to do it for a freebie, you know, it's a civic university kind of measure, or a bit of CSR, I don't know, but or margins, you know. The reason this is important, first of all, thank you for the bit about the audit, about the boundary commission. Electoral commission, oh God, why can't I get it right? Could we have that, page that you just referred to?
Certainly.
To see it? Because I mean, what the table is described as in 3.4 has been a combination of that and learning from other authorities. So it would be useful if we had the actual source of both of those things before we have that conversation.
Although it is a footnote on page 4, that is a hot link straight to that report.
Excellent. Well, in which case I needn't trouble the scores. I can do that myself, can't I? Save the officers the time. We're all about saving money today, aren't we? Now, the other thing I was going to ask you, Giles, was on this, was to do with the other change that will happen as a result of going to all-out elections. Because I'm aware that at the moment we have had some difficulty recruiting enough polling staff and counting staff to do the job in the day. Now, what will happen with the all-out elections, as it is referred to in here, is if they would take place on the same day as the Police and Crime Commissioner elections, and anticipating a terrible thing happening, which is us going to a joint committee with an elected official, which it describes in here as another thing, then that sounds to me like an awful lot of counting. And when you bear in mind they'd be counting the votes for 57 councillors, it's a long time since we've done that in this city, and if you've ever been involved in a 3-person election count, when you got 12, 15 candidates, let me tell you, that takes a long time. So if we're going for a cycle that has not one, but 3 elections on the same day, one of which is a 57-member all-out election, I wondered what factors we've put in about A, hire of premises, because that's taking out the Life Centre for at least 3 days. What that does to the area of polling places, what that does to any other incidental costs associated with trying to run 3 big elections. And by the way, that's without the general election being on any of those days just by accident. And so, you know, I think these things need factoring in. I think a real cost, you know, I mean, one piece of fact that is missing from this table is what was the last 10 years look like? I mean, we're assuming over the next 11 years, the general elections will only happen every 5 years. We've had, as of today, 4 prime ministers in 6 years and 3 general elections in a little over 6 years as well, right? So, you know, forgive me, but the historic cost of these elections is much less than is being described in this table.
Yes,
Sorry.
Councillor Lowry.
No, that was too
Thank you,
much, sorry.
thank you, Councillor.
Do we have to do a consultation? Could we just go to Chambers with the recommendations that this committee is not minded to carry out consultation, and we leave the rest of the recommendations in and do what we need to do when we need to do them? Is there a legal requirement for us to carry out a consultation prior to us making a decision?
No, there isn't. And like all one-word answers, it's extremely misleading. Because if there was any challenge of the council's decision to either retain its existing arrangements or go to all outs, if there was any challenge against the settled position of the council, it would no doubt rely on such evidence as the council hadn't consulted with the public over the issue. So it's not a legal requirement, but it does make the any eventual decision potentially more vulnerable to successful challenge. But in terms of this council on this approach, the council has asked the committee, it hasn't directed the committee with a proposal. Obviously, it didn't vote against the proposal when it was in front of it in March. It did refer it to this committee. But if this committee chose to go back to council and said, having considered this issue carefully, we don't think that a public consultation on the electoral cycle is in the best interest. That would be a recommendation back to full council, which it could then, obviously, the full council could take a view on that one way or the other. So there's no legal requirement to consult. I think potentially councils that either changed or stayed the same would be more vulnerable if they hadn't consulted.
I'm not advocating we don't have a consultation, but I don't like spending money, you know that, okay. And here we are, Slough Council, and less than 0.5% of its population, Derby Council 0.2, Worcester Council 0.3% of its population. If you added up all the contributions and the cost, just as an example, £32, 37 pence. That's what it costs to ask each individual their view and opinion. And the average response rate, if you're being generous, is just over 800. You know, and our method of consultation is to engage with, dare I say, the media, the council itself, members, 57 members, 2,000 officers. Are the members excluded from the consultation? Are officers excluded from the consultation? Because that's an interesting question if you think about it, because we're all incredibly biased in making the decision, you know, as are, dare I say, officers as well, because some of them will be employed in the area, and the savings that come from it will naturally come from, dare I say, them not being employed potentially. So that's why I asked the question, do we need to waste public taxpayers' money by undertaking a consultation when the response rate collectively across the whole of the local authorities that have carried out a similar exercise at the very best reaches 0.5%, at the worst is not even 0.11%, and like I say, if you were to take our expected cost on that average return rate, it's going to cost us £32, 36 pence to ask everybody, what do you think, mate? You know, which I prefer to ask the question of those that know best what is in the interests of this council, really.
I mean, really briefly, I know that was as much a statement as a question, Councillor Harry, but the Section 116 allows councils to design whatever approach they feel is appropriate to the question. And obviously, in recent times, we've looked more and more at online approaches to questionnaires, etc., etc. And I think, as the chair pointed out earlier on, a lot will, in terms of expenditure, a lot will rely on the methodology employed. Councillor Evans made a suggestion that we might team up with one of the universities in the city around undertaking that. I think it would certainly be incumbent on officers, subject to the decision made by the committee, to design something that I would absolutely want to guarantee that whatever methodology we chose would result in a more statistically representative sample of the survey than some other councils seem to have achieved. And I don't think, given our track record in some of our other consultations, that we can guarantee that. But in terms of the methodology, and they'll all have a cost. I think you're completely right. We base the cost on this really as being similar to the amount that traditionally the councils spent on either the city or resident survey, where we use an independent supplier to do some of the demographic work and the analysis in return for that. We could reduce those costs, obviously, A, if we did it in-house, or B, if we relied on something much more online, rather than, because the key cost in this is actually postage, which is, as you know, is quite expensive. So we could alter those costs, and I don't think we're setting the bar particularly high to say we'll have a significantly higher response rate than the examples that we've given you in the report.
I think it's important to note as well, I mean, we're talking about constitutional change here. I mean, yes, we're not changing the constitution of Great Britain, but we will be changing the constitution of this council. And the best way of dealing with it has got to be speaking to the people that put us in the chairs we're sitting in now. And the consultation process will assist. And I accept what you say, there is a statutory procedure should the council elect to do it, the resolution is passed, and then you've got to state the year in which it's implemented. But the consultation process in one shape or form ought to take place. And what I would like to see is for this committee to be instrumental in it. We pose the questions and make sure that the public get what they want. That's, I'm interested to see if anyone else thinks. Sorry, Councillor.
Yes, Chair, and I think Giles has said why it's all going to go wrong online. Who is our most favourite voter, the most consistent voter? It's the elderly. And when we talk about the carbon footprint, for example, the consultation will take place largely online. Who is the voter demographic which is less likely to use technology? So I think that, you know, when we make a decision, that we can't just wipe out one sway of voters because of an application of a key to the survey, for example. And I think this is where serious consideration needs to be given so that all voters have an equal opportunity to be able to take part in the consultation. And this move to online and online only, for the reasons I've just given, could set aside one of the most, you know, important demographics to all.
It's a very good point, Councillor Finn, and I for one would support that whatever model we adopt, we discuss and make sure we have a complete capture process where the widest group, the data is captured. And that, I think the onus is on this committee and the working group that will decide the literature and how we consult and which stakeholders we speak to as well. It's not just the people of Plymouth, it is businesses, it's other people involved. I think today the crux is whether we consult or not. And if we agree to consult, we have carte blanche to design the literature and work with the council officers to get this process in place. Does anyone else have anything to say about? Yes, Councillor Bennett.
So just listening to what's been said, I think there's a lot that can be learned from the examples that have been given. So I'd be interested to understand some of their learning around how they targeted different groups and the pros and cons of those. So I think some of what you're all describing around actually making sure that we target different segments of the population can be picked up from what other people have done over the last couple of years, given that we're trying to do it in quite a different world from 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago. So I think using those examples and maybe connecting with those different councils to find out what they find, has found benefit would be good. I also think there's a risk of the target population of the younger generation not necessarily being caught. So if I think about, my mum, nearly 80, very active on social media and the internet. A 95-year-old auntie is the same. I'm not saying they are the majority, but there are people who are active across all the population, but there are also other people who may be not as active, and how do we get to the younger population as well? So, the ones who are coming in, are coming out of school and coming into higher education, coming into employment, there's a whole younger group of people who may not really be cited on the activities of the council as well. So I think it's both ends of our age groups, I think, which we ought to be looking at. But lessons learned from other areas may be a good way of finding out how they have targeted, given the different scenarios that we've had over the last couple of years.
I think it's an excellent point you make, and also picking up Councillor Evans' point of earlier when he cited Plymouth University. Well, certainly Professors Thrasher and Rallings have got worldwide acclaim for their work on this sort of thing. And I personally would favour involving an institution like the University of Plymouth in this process as well. And the wealth of experience around the table here, I'm sure if we do consult and we do speak to authorities such as other local authorities and the university, we can come up with a full array of consultation documents, whether it's electronically sent or posted or whatever, to capture as much data as possible. I think Councillor Evans had a question.
Yes. Beg your pardon. Yeah, it's this business about moving to an all-out election in 2023. Now, unless I'm very much mistaken, we're not having all-out elections in 2023. So the basis of the table's wrong anyway. Actually, it works even greater in favour because, of course, there would only be £840,000 spent on all-out elections in the period between 2023 and 2032. So I just wanted to flag that up, that the savings are even greater than you describe. Unless I've missed something.
Thank you.
It's all right. Well, I would only, that, you know, as I say, I know there's no particular push towards the savings argument, but I do get the sense it is the fundamental driver here.
Sorry, for my benefit, being a bit dense, if you look at what you're saying on page 10.
Yeah,
So we got
4.4.
So we've got 3 elections on the trot. That's how our cycle works for the 4th year, sort of. So you're saying in 2003, where we would have an election in any event, because it's still within the 3-year cycle. But, I see the point you're making. There wouldn't have been an all-out election in year 3. Sorry, I do beg your pardon. Yeah.
That's right. There wouldn't be one in 23. There would, however, be one in 26, not 27. So the table's a bit of a mess, really, in that sense, isn't it?
Chair, I think the table was great on March the 21st and it's less great now.
Yeah, it's less great now. Yeah, you're quite right. You're quite right. Yeah.
I think Tudor Mayor raised a good point in respect to maybe we try to use the last 10 years as a historical starting point as to if you would have reflected on what happened in the last 10 years and compared it to what would have happened if you were at third, or out rather, that might be an easier way of drawing that argument to an end, because people are always going to say, yeah, but what happens if this happens? Well, actually, we're not doing that. Just simply look back. That's what it cost us last time. This is what it would have cost us if we went for third. So that might be an easier way to address that issue. But the question I wanted to ask the committee was the question that you raised. None of us are in any disagreement with respect to the principal recommendations around going back to full council with the dates for the boundary commission or electoral commission, whatever those charming people are called. The issue is the nature of the public consultation. And as you've seen from the paperwork before you, and whilst I'm encouraged to hear Giles' comments about how much better our consultation will be than anybody else's consultation, how is the committee going to feel when you got 500 comments back and it's only 0.2, 0.3, 0.8% of the population, which statistically is nonsense, really. I mean, I know Giles made the comment about court, you know, by having a consultation, you can at least sort of assure yourself in the court of law that you've done all things practicable.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's an element of any reasonable judge say, well, statistically, given the amount of people that actually been consulted here or actually taken part in the consultation, does that really add any benefit to the arguments being put forward by either party? So I'm probably stirring the pot and playing devil's advocate here, but how are you going to feel when you've got less than 0.5% of Plymouth population have come back to you? And bear in mind that vote could be 60-40. You know, you could be relying on 300 or 400 people with a view and opinion. And I can assure you, between Councillor Evans and I, we could probably get that number of people to give you a view and opinion via this consultation in our own little worlds, as it were. And you might choose to do exactly the same yourself. as my others as well. So it's about the value the consultation is genuinely adding. And if we are going to spend taxpayers' money doing it, then actually we need to do it in a way that I might argue would exclude certain individuals. But that becomes, once again, a very challenging prospect from a legal perspective, that I, as a councillor, cannot comment on this because I'm a net beneficiary of it.
A couple of good points you make there, Councillor Lowry. I mean, the first point, from analysing the financial implication by looking at historic elections, but of course the problem, as Councillor Evans mentioned earlier, we had about 3 general elections in close succession to one another, so that would distort the figures, I suspect, if we were to look at historic data. The second point, which is also a good point as well, is how do we square this? Well, clearly, the most important point is to consult the people of this city. So at least we have been candid, we've invited as many people as possible, and then ultimately, I think the way all these sort of samples work is that the political analysts out there have a way of taking samples and taking core information. But I think the most important thing is if we offer up a wide consultation where we don't leave any stone unturned, so the elderly are consulted, the young people, as Mrs. Benny is referred to, are consulted through whatever medium is appropriate to them, I feel sure we will get the result we need.
So let me ask you then,
I would take a sounding from, say, Thrashers and Ralling and the university, or people who design these sort of things. So I wouldn't give an answer off the top of my head. I would take professional advice so we don't fall foul of the law, as you quite rightly say.
Chair. I would expect to be held to account by members for working with them to both design, conduct and implement a consultation that was statistically sound. If it proved, and I think this council's got a pretty strong track record in making sure that when it does consult, it does it to the absolute best of its ability and it works hard. I wouldn't like to deprecate any of the other councils who've undertaken this work. Yes, in fact, I would. Some of those levels are pitifully small, and I would expect to be held to account by members for not having designed a process and worked with them to produce something that gave a better result. It is clear that this isn't an issue that it's very easy to attract people's attention and views on. I think we can glean that from the work that we've done. And that's a little bit like the eternal debate about turnout, isn't it, in terms of who turns out to vote. And I like to think that this isn't only for people on our electoral register. I mean, you'll all be aware of the fact that we work very closely with 16 and 17-year-olds as well, who we call attainers, who are coming up to voting. They're really important consultees in this as well, because they will be voters at some point in the future, and we'd like to know what their views are as well. I think a well-designed and well-informed and passionate approach to garnering the views of our citizens on something that, whilst it might not appear very important, actually is very important, is a job both for our comms colleagues but also our engagement experts to make sure that this really works. And I wouldn't expect to bring in front of you, expecting you to take account of a sample of less than 1,100, which is quite often the minimum statistically relevant sample that pollsters use.
Thank you, Giles. So you're satisfied, Councillor Lowry's question is that we should be able to get a truly representative, meaningful return in order to allay his fears. Yes?
Yes, but the proof of the pudding will be in the tasting. Obviously, I would expect that. Yes, we're these are relevant questions, and we've got some experience in undertaking this sort of work.
Thank you, Mr. Parrott. Councillor Finn.
Just some clarification. I'll offer a response when you tell me. How long have you got to carry out this consultation, or what would be the end date for carrying it out by?
We've
it's very loosely written.
Yeah, it's funny, if you look at a whole municipal year, you would have thought you have ample opportunities for carrying out consultation periods. Our experience is that a period not necessarily including a large part of the summer holidays of at least 2 months to allow people to undertake that work, and at least a month to do proper analysis of the results is necessary. We wanted to avoid the pre-election period, not surprisingly. We were anxious also about the Christmas and budget setting period that was difficult. As we've done before with certain other consultations, a post-election, but pre or taking into account the extra time needed because of the summer break, with a view to any consideration that was agreed on taking place in September in advance of a December confirmation with the Boundary Commission, was why this has been designed in the way that it has been.
Chair,
For the sake of clarity for the committee, looking at the time frame which is spelt out on the last page, we have, to my mind, sufficient time now to do a proper job of designing the literature, and it takes us then right down to the elections in May, and then after the election is when we finally consult. Is that correct? Is that your general idea?
That's how it's set out, yes.
yeah, obviously this comes within my professional sphere, and normally to carry out a consultation of this depth would take 6 months, and that includes the quantifying and qualifying of all the data that actually comes in on this. So what I was looking at is, if one was to look at the timescales actually put forward here, there's no finite end to it. However, if one was by early 2023, what is early? Is that before June, January to June, whatever, that we have elections coming up in May? Wouldn't it be appropriate to direct it towards the May elections? A questionnaire that could be put out with the voting cards, and then garner a response from there to get a more comprehensive view of what the general opinion is.
Chair, I'm not sure if Councillor Finn's looking at the right place. The consultation will be designed and agreed following a council decision in December, and the period of consultation carried out will be May to August 2024, and then there'll be a period of analysis following that. And I completely understand how you said that. Why not put it out with the more general voting in the local elections? And that did cross my mind before I looked at the legislature. We're specifically precluded from doing so.
I think also, Councillor Finn, that perhaps we would have sufficient time, given the fact if we vote on the consultation in principle today, to put together a working group and start putting together the substance of the consultation.
Just to clarify, Chair, with regard to the point raised, 3.1, the consultation could take place as soon as practically possible, be scheduled for later this year or early 2023. It doesn't actually say specifics. A decision could alternately be to delay to commit to carrying out a public consultation in line with the electoral review by the Local Government Boundary Commission. So that's where I was coming from, not the actual timeline that you proposed, but 3.1.
I understand that, yes, and we've just taken that forward and put it into a little bit more detail in the timeline on page 17.
Ms. Evans.
So, I'm going to put a proposition forward about stuff, because I've just, we just had a look at the table, which was making a financial argument to this committee about why it should go forward, and the financial argument is not true. It's actually a greater financial argument, if you like, if you're talking about savings, than actually is described in the paper. So there may be other errors like that which we would need to look at. But I cannot see the reason for turning down my and Councillor Lowry's proposition that we should see the historical context. We've had an exceptional period in this decade of elections. We had an election in 2010, 2015, 2017 and 2019. Who knows? We may still have one in 2022. But if we go past history, I mean, in the 1970s, there was 4. So it's not, I mean, what we're talking about here is a decade where we're anticipating just 2 general elections in a decade. Now, I'm just wondering, when did that last happen? So I think it is important that we look at what has happened in the past, because you have to evaluate that. Because what we've been asked to do here is to, can I put it, I'll call it the best case scenario. I don't mean it in any way like that, but where there are only 2 general elections. And that isn't actually in line with historical precedent. And so I think we have a right to examine all the facts, not just some facts, before we make a decision, certainly if we're advocating on financial grounds.
Chair, I'd just like to remind the committee that we're not in any way discussing whether an election cycle be either by thirds or by all outs. We've been asked by the council to agree consultation arrangements with the public over their view of what our election cycle would be. As I've said before, the advantage and disadvantage for this committee have been drawn from the Electoral Commission's site and are not the subject of individual bias from these officers. And we've already said that the financial estimates are not in any way have specific profile against a large number of arguments the Electoral Commission and others have put forward for varying the political cycle from the one that this council currently adopts. Once again, the recommendation before this committee is to whether or not consult on cycles and not to do with individual cycles or their costs.
Looking at the minute from the council, I'm absolutely in agreement with you. The matter has been deferred to this committee for resolution today on consultation only. I think the simplest way is we just simply vote whether we go for the proposition and move it forward that way.
Can we just check that all members, in respect of the consultation discussion, are content that they don't have anything further to add in respect of that item, please?
Yes, certainly. Before we do, yes, Councillor.
Well, in which case I'm going to put a caveat in, and I'll ask if it can be noted for the record. I doubt if it will be, but I'll ask, which is that I don't want to hear in a month's time or whenever we next meet that this is the basis upon which we're consulting. Because the basis upon which we're consulting is based on a table that's wrong, with opinions that aren't proven. And I want to just make sure that we don't get any backsliding on that we start with a clean slate in terms of how we're going to progress in the subcommittee. I want that assurance, otherwise I'm voting against today.
Sorry,
I'm just checking, I'm thinking out loud here. Giles, this paper is going to go to full council, okay, for deliberation anyhow. So therefore, based on what you said in your last response to Councillor Evans in respect of the data financially, can we ensure that this paper provides information relevant to the recommendations and no more than that, please?
Certainly, I recommend that actually a new report is submitted to council covering the issues raised at this committee today. And I think, Chair, at the beginning you offered that this committee would have could potentially have control over be involved in the development of the material associated with this, and that could quite easily be part of the agreement today that would happen, by way of reassurance to Councillor Evans that this committee would see material connected with it. And I'm more than happy to both include, and it's quite easy to include the last 10 years data in that financial chart as well. It's not necessary to to change the outcome at all, but for information we can. I'm happy to take that as well in terms of undertaking those corrections, but we don't necessarily have this report again at committee. It will be the what this committee discussed and what it's recommending to council as opposed to this report. And I'm sure you're coming to it, Chair, but I heard Councillor Lowry saying if there is any contention around the potential date for the electoral review, it would be very useful if we were able to cover that as well.
And I totally agree with Councillor Evans that if we are going to do this, we're going to do it properly. We will be involved in it. I would suggest we do have a working group. There's no way I would permit this to go through unless this committee is instrumental in designing the questionnaires, the literature that goes out, and we decide the actual medium to consult. So it's not simply just press a button on an obscure website. With that, I think let's hear the proposition, unless anyone else has got anything to say on the subject.
Can I just,
Yes.
just clarifying that the recommendations will have a footnote to the effect that a revised report will be reduced to reflect the reasons and the recommendations and no information over and above that. So I am rejecting Giles's proposal to add more information in respect of financial. Not relevant, let's take it out. And actually, I think it's a good lesson for us all. You know, let's keep to the substantive, and the information relevant in the report should be in respect of that and no more.
Off the absolute top of my head, Councillor Larry, I don't see a problem with that at all. It would be a very short report to full council, but I think that's relatively straightforward. Well, in fact, it's great. We like short reports.
Members present, the proposition is the Audit and Governance Committee recommend to the Council that a public engagement consultation is undertaken using the powers under Section 116 of the Local Government Act 2003 between June and August 2023 on the issue of moving from the current electoral cycle of elections to the whole council elections once every 4 years. The Audit and Governance Committee oversee and agree the design and implementation of the consultation, in particular, who will be consulted, engaged with and how, and that's the big point for me. And number 3, the Council confirms that the Boundary Commission review commences in December 2023 and is conducted across 2024-2025 with resulting arrangements implemented in 2026. Could I have a show of hands? Who's for the proposition? That's unanimous.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, with that, the clock is at 3:15. We're all going to go home for tea.
Right, but thank you.
Thank you, Chair.